Welcome everyone to the third Thursday meetup of the West Orlando WordPress Meetup Group. I'm Rob Watson, a co-organizer and host, and West Orlando WordPress is an official WordPress meetup group and is affiliated with the main WordPress Orlando and WordCamp US meetup groups. Websites need privacy policies and terms of use, but what should be in those policies? What procedures need to be in place to implement the policies, and what impact do your technical choices have on privacy considerations? In this presentation, Karen Greene will provide an overview of privacy laws and discuss the technical best practices for implementing the legal requirements. Karen is a Florida licensed attorney who loves to build WordPress websites. Her journey with WordPress started in 2013 when she started a personal blog about her knitting, crocheting, spinning, weaving, dyeing, and sewing projects. She started by picking a theme, customizing the appearance, and forgetting about it. In 2018, she became the technology chair for the Florida Tropical Weavers Guild and took over their website. This project led her deeper into WordPress as she built it into a membership site and a registration portal for their 2021 virtual conference. Unlike many people, she loves the block editor. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone to mute their microphones for the presentation. And Karen, thank you so much for being our presenter this evening. The time is now yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for being here. Because I am an attorney, I have to start with disclaimers. While I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney, so this presentation does not constitute legal advice and is solely for informational and educational purposes. By attending or watching the recording of this webinar, you understand there's no attorney-client relationship intended or formed between you and me. And the contents of this presentation are off the record and not for attribution by the press, and that includes bloggers. If you want to contact me, my email address is at the end of the presentation. This is our roadmap for this evening. Because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to start with some definitions. I'm going to do an overview of the legal landscape of privacy law. I'm going to give you some examples of what goes into a privacy policy and terms of use. And then I'm going to go through 10 privacy principles to keep in mind for when you're designing websites. And as we go through those principles, I'm going to show you some practical applications in WordPress. Definitions. So when we were talking about this presentation, Rob kept saying you're presenting about security, and I kept saying no, it's about privacy. So I thought I'd start here. Privacy and security are overlapping, but they are two different things. While we are talking about protecting data in both cases, privacy is focused specifically on what we call personally identifiable information, which we'll define in the next slide. And it's usually talking about known actors. So the website owner and what the website owner does with the information that they have. Security is focused on all the data with your website. So that could include things like the contents of your website, the intellectual property, the full database, which is going to include personally identifiable information, but probably is going to include more than that. And then it's also focused on either unknown actors, so a hacker, or unauthorized actors like an employee of a business owner and that employee shouldn't have access to the personal information. Personally identifiable information, the definition differs from one privacy law to another. In the United States, the stuff that's in the first column, email address, passwords, the second column, are generally what we're talking about, although depending on which specific law we're talking about, we could include other things. Some of the other things on this list are from other parts of the world, and this list is not a complete list. Also, sometimes, like first name and last name, for example, yes, that's personally identifiable, but it's probably not personally identifiable unless it's paired with other information. So my name is Karen Greene. That's, in the United States, a pretty generic name. It's generic enough that I share it with my sister-in-law. And so which Karen Greene are we talking about? First and last name isn't necessarily enough. You'd need to have it paired with my email address or something like that. So sometimes it takes more than one piece together to qualify as personally identifiable information. Data controller, this is a concept, the term actually comes out of GDPR, the European Union's law. However, the concept exists in other privacy laws too. We're generally talking here about the person or entity responsible for deciding which data to collect and how to use it, and usually that's going to be whoever owns the website. A data processor is an organization or service that actually collects the data and then presents it to the data controller. And most often, this is going to be a third-party service, but depending on how the website is built, it's possible that the website owner is processing the data too. All right, overview of the legal landscape. The GDPR is neither the beginning nor the end of privacy law. And I feel like often when we have these conversations about privacy, everybody jumps immediately to GDPR. And I think that's because that conversation has been happening the longest. GDPR has been applicable in force now for 3 years. There was 2 years to implement it. It was in discussion as legislation before that. And so it's the first thing that brought privacy issues into common conversation. But it is not necessarily applicable to everyone, and the material that it contains is not necessarily the best place to start or end. I'm going to go through several slides here of other types of laws that might be applicable, and none of these are a comprehensive list. So this is a list of laws in Florida. Data breach is the first one on this list. So what happens if your website is hacked? Who do you have to tell about that? When do you have to tell them? That's what data breach is. And then the rest of the things on this list are mostly, I did want to talk about right of publicity. That means like you can't use a famous person's picture without their consent. And it actually doesn't even have to be a famous person. You can't just randomly take a picture of a person and use it on your website. Government in the Sunshine in Florida, we have very broad public records laws, but we do have exceptions to that. And so if you're working on a government website, I'm sure they'll tell you about what those exceptions are. But one example might be that generally social security numbers have to be redacted. And in some cases, there's certain categories of people whose records don't appear. So and that would be judges, police officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys. They can have some of their records redacted from the public records, especially, or at least pieces of their information like their addresses. And I just wanted to also point out that in the last 2 legislative sessions, Florida has had privacy protection bills introduced, but they have not passed. So this is a conversation that's happening of some sort of broader privacy protection being passed in Florida. Other US states and territories, we could create a list like I just showed you for Florida for every state. And Florida's was incomplete, and some states protect things that Florida doesn't. So for example, Florida does not have any privacy laws that are specific to employees, and there are states that do. All 50 states have some sort of data breach laws, and all of these kinds of laws are extraterritorial in nature, which means that even if you're not within those states, you may find yourself needing to comply with them. If you have, for example, data that's stolen from your website and that person lives in New York, you have to comply with the New York data breach laws when it comes to reporting that, who you have to report that information to and how long you have to do it. And that varies a lot from one state to another. Data privacy specific, California is the big one that most people know about because it was the first one passed here. Virginia has passed one that's effective later this year. New York and Nevada and a couple of other states have partial laws that don't necessarily go as far as something like GDPR or the California law. And 11 states, I checked this about 2 weeks ago, so 11 states currently have legislation that is under discussion. Whether or not they'll pass and what the specifics of those look like is still to be determined. Generally applicable federal laws. The Federal Trade Commission is the first of these. privacy practices can be regulated as unfair and deceptive practices. So what that exactly means is going to vary, but that is one way that privacy gets generally policed. In addition, the FTC is responsible for enforcing GDPR privacy shield provisions in the United States. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act has pieces that are relevant if you're building a site that is specifically aimed at children. There are very special provisions when related to the collection of information about children. Can spam is something that if you're working with setting up like an email list, there's laws in can spam that are relevant to email lists. And also the same thing in the Telemarketing and Consumer Fraud Abuse Prevention Act. So these are just some of the things that do impact privacy in the United States. And then these are sector specific, and this again is not a comprehensive list. And if you're working on these kinds of websites, you need to be asked, I'm sure they'll be telling you about what it is that they need to comply with. Other countries. More than 120 countries around the world have privacy laws. That includes individual countries. It also includes other regional agreements like GDPR. There's a similar thing for the Asia Pacific region. And many countries, Brazil actually is the most recent privacy law, goes into effect later this year. I think it's July. Many countries have multiple laws that are relevant. So just like in the United States, we have a patchwork and it may depend on the context of your site. The same is true in other countries. And even in the European Union, GDPR is a floor, not a ceiling. It was originally passed intending to be sort of the whole, to bring everything together, but the reality is that countries can pass laws that are more restrictive than GDPR, and several of them have. And finally, your contractual clauses may contain provisions that you need to comply with in terms of privacy. And so that could be agreements that between you and your service providers. Most of any CDN that's worth its salt is going to have data privacy provisions in it. Are you complying with those? What agreements do your clients have with service providers? Whether that could be in a point of sale arrangement, it could be in affiliate arrangements, any kind of service provider, what do those contractual terms say? And then of course, in the contract that you form with your client when you're going to build their website, what do you have in your contract related to privacy? And so of course that brings us to this question. What law applies to my client's site? And this is a legal question. It is a question of taking the facts of your client's business and knowing what the law is and how those things go together. And because it's a legal question, it's not one that you need to be answering. Answering a legal question when you're not an attorney is actually a felony. Practicing law and providing advice, and that includes that can include drafting documents, is a legal work, and so is providing advice on what law that they need to comply with. So what do you do when you're the web tech person and you're not the attorney? First of all, start by thinking of privacy as a business requirement. When you're talking to people about their websites and building their websites, you're always trying to find out what are their business requirements. You're asking them questions because you're trying to understand their business. And that is the approach that you should take with privacy. Also, ask questions that are data specific. And also, you're in a really great position as the web designer to know what data is being collected because you're creating some of this anyways. So part of this might be thinking about it specifically in privacy. There may not be any additional data collection that you need to ask about. But, and a data audit is the first step of complying with many of the existing privacy laws. You need to know what data you have and what you're actually doing with it. And so that's something that you can be documenting as you're working on a site. Some of the things that you might also want to consider in here is, are there intersections between the website and other business systems? For example, a point of sale system. If they're doing inventory and they're on a point of sale system that's common to the website and to their physical store, for example, and those things are tied together, what are the privacy implications of that and how you work with it? So that's just a few thoughts on treating privacy as a business requirement. The other piece of treating privacy as a business requirement is thinking of it in terms of marketing to the customers of the website owner, because couching it in terms of we talk about a lot of times the no trust like funnel of working with clients. And so talking explicitly about privacy in terms of we care about you and we're going to take care of your data to the best of our ability can go towards that marketing piece of people getting to know you and that you care about them as a client. Follow privacy best practices. We're going to spend a time talking about that, so I'm just going to go past that for now. I'm going to talk about what some of those best practices look like. Contractual provisions. Here I'm talking about contractual provisions between you and the person you're building a website for. So if you're not an attorney, your contract and your proposals should specifically say that legal services are out of scope and that you're not an attorney and you're not providing legal advice. You can also, in your contractual provisions, consider putting limitations on privacy services. So this is something that I have seen in the context of accessibility, that some people put into their contracts that we cannot guarantee compliance with a specific level of accessibility. Such services are beyond the scope of this contract, and there would be additional costs if we were going to meet any particular level. You could do something similar to that with privacy services. You can also, in your contract, limit the total amount that's recoverable, so that one of the reason I'm talking about this is I've seen on some of the forums, the WordPress forums, people are really concerned about their clients suing them if the website's not compliant with privacy notices. And one thing I have seen people doing is they're actually trying to get clients to sign a waiver on privacy that says, we've told you about privacy and you're choosing not to do it. I personally don't think that's worthwhile. I think that you shouldn't be advising your clients on privacy to begin with in a way that would make you liable in that sense. So I think you're better off putting some provisions in your contract to help limit your liability in that sense. Also, if you have cyber insurance, which is something that's becoming more and more common, not just for people who are tech people like us, but also for businesses themselves, this is something that you could discuss with the insurance provider in terms of limitations that you might want to have in your contracts. And finally, search and replace. Search and replace, put that in here because in general, if you have a template, like if you have a template privacy policy and all you're doing is changing the client name, right, or identifying information for the client, that's not practicing law. Like, you can fill out a form without practicing law. So that is another way to solve this problem of getting a privacy policy for our clients without straying into the practice of law. Get a template, just change, search and replace. Okay, what are some terms that are in privacy policies? Oops. I actually, looks like I have to end that in order to switch to the website. Okay, so this is a website that I built for my mother earlier this year for her book release. And I'm starting here with the terms of use. Terms of use, most of this is pretty what we call boilerplate. It's pretty standard language that doesn't change a lot from one site to another. And there's only a couple of things in here that are specifically related to privacy. So I wanted to talk about those things. One is user eligibility. So one of the things that's happening here is, I'm sorry, I should have said, is this legible? I know sometimes when I share my screen that the font looks small. Do I need to make it bigger?
I think it looks fine.
Okay, thank you. So this is where I'm limiting you. We don't want anybody under the age of 18 using this site, and we don't want personal information from you. You should be able to enter into a contract in order to view the site. You see the privacy policy here. We're specifically incorporating the privacy policy here. Mostly that's because some of the things in here have to do with how are we going to resolve disputes. Like if somebody did want to sue us. And this is another thing, the governing law, we always are going to say that it's Florida because we're located in Florida. And if we want it to be convenient, if someone's going to sue us, I will say that some of the governing law, it's various privacy policies, various privacy laws across the world also have jurisdictional statements, and that may override this. And there was one other thing I was going to, ownership of content. So talking about who owns the site, and this is something that comes up often in privacy law, and it is also included in the privacy policy, which you'll see in a minute, but it is also here in the terms of use. And also the terms of, I always put on policies that I write when they were published, and then a record of any changes. It's a change log, just like you would see on software all the time. So this is terms of use. This is the privacy policy that I wrote for this site. And I wanted to point out there's a lot of information. The headings are pretty much the same on any kind of privacy policy. So you are always needing to provide information. You're probably going to have definitions, although the way this happens can happen in different places, and sometimes this information is included in one of the other headings. But who owns the site, the information that you're actually collecting from people, what's collected directly, which is usually going to be through a form, or what's collected automatically, like your analytics, how we use the information that we obtain, what information we share and who we're sharing it with. And those are really the ones that are going to be pretty standard from one site to another, regardless of what privacy law that you are complying with. Now, you'll see I have several other sections in here. How we protect your information, like this is, where we're using our best security precautions and to protect you, but of course this is never going to be 100%. Data retention is a really important thing in a lot of privacy laws. In every privacy law, how long are you actually retaining data that you collect? How routinely do you delete data? So that's what this is about. Third-party websites and links. You have embedded content, like you have a video embedded from YouTube. Well, YouTube is collecting analytics. So that's what that section is about. Do not track is specifically one of the provisions of the California privacy law says that a part of it is that people are supposed to be able to opt out of being tracked across the internet. What does that even mean? Nobody seems to know. So actually in this provision, I am disclaiming that and saying we don't change anything because we don't know what it means. International transfers. This is something that comes up in GDPR and other privacy laws around the world, is where is the data collected and where does it end up? So if I'm collecting data and the processor is located in the European Union and the person who is in the European Union when the data is collected, and then that data ends up in the United States, that's a transfer of data has happened. This is a really tricky thing right now. I briefly mentioned earlier the Privacy Shield, which is a provision of the GDPR that was basically generally applicable to the United States. That got destroyed last July. There was a case involving Facebook in Ireland, and as a result, the U.S. Privacy Shield that protected businesses that were trying to comply with GDPR has gone away, and nobody really knows what our status is right now. So international transfers is a really big deal right now. Rights. This list happens to be the list from the GDPR because we actually know that some people that were going to be accessing this site are in the EU. But different laws have different sets of rights. So California has some of the same rights here, but they also have additional rights. Like, so for the California privacy law, one of the rights is the right to be able to opt out of having your data sold. And so that's an example of another thing that isn't necessarily here in this law. And children's privacy, which I talked about a little bit in the terms of use. And then how to contact. This is generally in order to, if somebody has an objection, like they want to port their data, they want you to erase them, how do they contact you? You have to be able to provide a way that they let you know what they want. The terms of use provision, this is just incorporating terms of use into here so that we have the, the jurisdiction of where you want to sue us and all that kind of stuff. And again, I have the revisions, so anytime there's a change log. I also add this third-party service providers list. And if I click down here, this is a list of the service providers that we use on this website with links to their privacy policies. And this is, again, this depends on what law you're complying with, whether you need the literal list. Some people interpret the laws to say you just need a list of the categories. So I wouldn't need to say Clean Talk. I could just say we use anti-spam software without identifying which anti-spam software that we use. I personally prefer to provide a list of the actual providers for reasons that I will get into a little later. Now, I am going to show you that there are some automated privacy policy generators, and one of those is built in to WordPress. So let me click over here. This is a website for, my husband and I are building an app, and this is the marketing website for it. And so if I go to the settings in WordPress and I come down to privacy, first of all, I can identify a privacy policy page. So just like you can identify a home page and a blog page, you can identify here where your privacy policy lives and use this page. But you are also able to automatically generate a privacy policy by pressing this button. Now, before I press this button, I'm also going to point out up here, you have a settings and you have a policy guide. So I'm going to go to the policy guide first. This has a template, and this tells you what is in their template. So it's very generic. And this down here, if you click on the policies, this gives you some suggested text for this website. So if I actually click back to settings over here, what I get when I hit this create button is I get that same suggested text information that was showing up on the guide page. And so this is a way that WordPress has built in a way for you to generate a privacy policy. And as you can see here, there's definite portions of what was in the other privacy policy, the privacy policies that I personally wrote, but there's a lot that's not here. However, they are not the only automated policy generator. And I put 4 companies here. Termageddon in particular is active in the WordPress space. These companies do similar things, but not necessarily the same. They have different types of policies that are available. They cover different jurisdictions. Ayubenda is the first one listed there, is a good one if you have multiple parts of the world that you need to comply with. Termageddon is currently more US based, but they are working on EU. Some of these companies also have other types of agreements, like an end user license agreement, if that's something you would need, or they have cookie policies, and some of them also have cookie pop-ups. So looking at these, and most of these, actually I think all of these sites they can be consumer-based, but they also work with agencies so that you can purchase a service and resell it if that's something that you want to do. So this is another way that you can do automated policy generating and not worry about accidentally providing legal advice. All right, so now I'm going to switch to privacy principles for when you're designing a website. These are 4 different standards that I put the links into this presentation so that you can look at them later. The first 2 listed on this, Privacy by Design and the Global Privacy Standard, are more like what I would call value statements of this is your overarching approach to take, whereas the ISO and NIST standards are more like a checklist that you can work through. So I'm actually going to show you a page of the NIST standards here. So this framework, so they have these different categories of things that you need to consider, basically. And as you go through, it's, okay, we have to inventory and map. So have you inventoried them, like step by step, like things that you could walk through to consider, have I gotten all my inventory and mapping done? And this goes on for several pages, and obviously I'm not going to take the time to go through it, but I just wanted you to see the difference between that and what we're going to do right now, which is to go through this global privacy standard. And this PDF, you know, if you click on that, there's 10 of them, and I'm going to go through all 10 of them. I've rearranged them in this presentation compared to what they are because I thought there was a more logical way to talk about them in the context of WordPress. Okay, so the first overarching concept is absolutely minimizing the data that you collect. Most of the privacy laws have some sort of limitation that you're only allowed to collect data that it is fair, and lawful for you to collect. Some of them are very strict that you must have a legal basis, and some of them are a little bit more loosey-goosey, like if you have a legitimate business interest in the information, then fine. But think about your data in terms of the strict minimum. And also think about defaulting to non-identifiable interactions and transactions. What do you really need to know in this context? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. 2 months ago, I was registering to attend a book event. And I'm a member of this online book club. They were having an author speak about a newly published book. The event was no additional cost to people who were already paid members of the book club, but you had to register, and it was an Eventbrite link. So I click over to Eventbrite, and I get my ticket, and I click to complete the transaction, and then I have a form I have to fill out. Well, it ended up being this really big survey. Like the first page was like, okay, no big deal. I get to the second page. I mean, it was a very detailed socioeconomic demographic data that they were asking me in order to attend like this free event for a group that I'm already a member of. And I couldn't even tell whether or not I was registered for the event. I couldn't figure out if I could bypass this or if I had to fill it out to register. I ended up clicking away, and I do think they did still send me the link, but like at the moment when I was faced with the form, I literally couldn't tell if I was registered for the event. In comparison to that, I would just show you the website for the app that my husband and I are building, and we are a couple of weeks away, we think, from submitting it to the iOS store. So we have an email list. I've got about 40 people on the email list, and I send out a newsletter giving them updates. And usually in the newsletter, I include a poll, and the poll links back to the website. It's a form on our website. Now, when I was making those forms, I was thinking about, do I really need to know who gave me a specific answer to the form? And the reality is, I really don't. So those forms do not include first name, last name, email address on them. They only have the poll questions. That's it. You don't have to be logged in. I did find out when I was working on this presentation that the form was automatically collecting the IPN, and I've now shut that off globally on that website. So because I don't need that, I'm not doing anything with it. So I'm just giving you those as two examples. Think carefully, what data do I really need to have? What data am I really going to use? Openness and transparency. So this is in terms of talking to the consumer, talking to the user of your website. Are you really telling them, not only are you telling them what you're doing, but are you actually doing that? Like, one of the things is that these policies and procedures are not set them and forget them. It's not, I have a policy and I've done enough. It's, am I actually doing in what I say I'm going to do? In addition, is it easy for people to know what you're doing? So to this end, I wanted to show you another website that I work on, the Florida Tropical Weavers Guild. So this website, in the FAQs, I actually have a legal section, which actually, as I was thinking about this, preparing this presentation, I'm going to change this to say policies. But you can see here, I have a bunch of stuff. I have the terms of use. I have the privacy policy. In this case, we have some other things which can be privacy related, but we have virtual and usually in person, but this year virtual event. So the event policies and code of conduct go to that. Copyright notice. We have people who are submitting pictures to us, so we have guidelines on that. So all of this stuff, it's in an easy place to find. In addition, when I was showing you these before, this is in a font that is the normal font I'm using on the website. I've made it easy to get around because this table of contents, these are links. So I used anchors here, on-site anchors, and then I have the return to the top. So it's easy to get around in the policy, and everything is very clearly labeled, even the subsections. So if you're trying to find something specific, I've made it as easy as possible. So these are just a couple of examples. It's not of what I mean when I'm talking about, is it readily available? But also, I mean, is it accurate? Are you really doing only the things that you said you're doing? All right, we have three sections here that are, I'm going to talk about forms in relationship to these next three pieces. So what is the purpose of collecting the data? Why are you collecting it? Why do you use it? Why do you retain it? When and why do you disclose it? And all of those things should be specifically communicated to the people you're collecting information from. At or before the time the information is collected, you can't decide after the fact to use data for a specific purpose that you weren't given permission to use it for. The individual user needs to give free and specific consent to the use of the data. The more sensitivity that the data itself has, the greater the burden is here in being very clear about what you're collecting and how you're using it. And there needs to be a mechanism for withdrawing consent. And finally, Are you actually using it for the purposes that you said you're going to use it for? And how long are you retaining it? It should be retained for the minimum amount of time to fulfill your purpose. So I'm going to show you here some settings in the form plugin that I use. Now, I personally use Fluent Forms Pro. I assume that you may have settings similar to this in other form programs. So first of all, I'm in my global settings here, and this is the disable IP logging. So this is now turned on. If I go and I look at a specific form, so this is one of the surveys that I did, and if I open a specific response, you can see that it did collect the user IP address because I didn't have that checked at the time, but that would not appear there. And again, you can see here that this form is only collecting a couple of questions, no personal data here. On the, oops, click the wrong thing, on the settings for the individual form, I also have options for double opt-in. I usually don't have this checked here because when I'm collecting email addresses for my list, it's connected to ConvertKit, which is what we use on this site for email. And I do the double opt-in thing generates out of ConvertKit, not off of my website. But we do opt-in. Here, require user to be logged in. I have that turned off because, again, I don't need to I don't need it to protect it in that way, but I can. That would be a place where I am collecting data. And then you know what? I guess it's in the global settings. There's one other thing here. Okay, where did it go? I have a setting in here that allows me to delete, that it will automatically delete entries after they're received. Because you can see here, I have all of these entries, right? And how long do I really need to keep these? I had not even considered that. Think about when you have a general contact form. Somebody might send you a question and you've answered that question. It was 3 years ago and it's no longer relevant to anything. Like, why do I have the actual entry here? So being thoughtful about deleting the entries that you have on your forms is one way to think about this. Okay. So these next couple of things have to do with the rights of the user. And so they have the right for their information to be accurate and complete and up to date. Most of the privacy laws have some sort of provisions that look something like this. And they usually have the right to access their data, to be informed about how it's used and when it's disclosed, to challenge the accuracy, and specifically in the context of GDPR, they also have the right to have their data deleted. WordPress has a couple of tools built in for this purpose. So if you, on the admin site, if I click on tools, you'll see here it says export personal data, erase personal data. So I'm going to click on export personal data. Earlier today, I was testing this out, so I made a request. So what happens here is somebody contacts you. I'm going to assume they do it through your contact form. You put in their email address here, and this generates a confirmation email. I didn't click on the confirmation, but if I click on the confirmation in the email that I received, then what happens is there is a link here, and I can then send another email which includes the data that we have on that person. It comes through as a JSON file. So the person who has asked for their data is going to get a JSON file with any data that they is on your site. The erase function works similarly. So you just put in the username, it creates this right here. They send a confirmation, yes, I want my data erased, and then you have the button here to force erase. And then I can also, I'm just going to click here to complete the request. So you can see this marks it as completed, and you can remove it or you can leave it here as a log. So these two tools, the export personal data and erase personal data, these were added to WordPress specifically to help with GDPR compliance. In about, it was 4.8 or 4.9, I forget which it was. All right, so the next three pieces of things to keep in mind, these have more to do with the website owner or perhaps you as the builder of the website. Accountability, we're talking about here mostly about the website owner. Are there actual policies and procedures? What do you do when you get a request to have your data, someone's data released? What do you do if you have a data breach? Like these, anybody who is involved in handling of the data needs to know what happens. It's not just having a policy on the website. It's also what do we do to make sure we're actually doing what we say we're doing. Security, of course, security is a topic in and of itself, but it is a part of privacy, making sure that the personal information that you have within your control is actually protected throughout its life cycle. And different laws have different language related to security. California's law actually says use reasonable standards for securing data. And finally, compliance. So compliance means, do you communicate to people how they can tell you they want their data to review or erased? Are you actually doing your processes? How are you monitoring what's happening with privacy? You know, privacy law is changing constantly. It is not a set it and privacy is not a set it and forget it thing. Most of the laws require that you review your privacy policies on a regular basis. California specifically says at least annually. GDPR says on a reasonable basis, but doesn't specify a specific time frame. So are you continuing with the processes that you have in place? And finally, these are some additional resources with additional information. The International Association of Privacy Professionals has certifications. So if this is something that you want to learn more about and get certified in, the CIPP is really mostly for lawyers, but CIPM and CIPT are people who manage data and the technologists who are providing the technology solutions. It's a couple $1,000s for the training course, plus there are fees to sit for the exams. The same organization has the Privacy Advisor podcast. They've been doing it since 2017, every other week, 30 to 45 minutes on what's happening right now in privacy. It's a great way to keep abreast of these topics if that's something you want to do. And Global Privacy Assembly is an organization it's an international organization where data managers from around the world are members of. These standards that we just went through originated from them. European Data Protection Board is the administrative agency for GDPR, and they have guidance on there. And finally, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This is a US governmental agency that you can subscribe to updates from. And I've done that, and you get about a daily email telling you all of the breaches and stuff from all over in all kinds of software. So not just WordPress. And do we have any questions?